I heard a sermon similar to this probably a month ago, and really got to me, and so I wanted to present it before y'all. I really think it can change the way we look at church, the way we do church, the way we are right now at Cornerstone. I think it can just reshape our whole way of thinking. So, what comes to mind when you hear the word church? For most of you. Raise your hand, speak out, I don't care.
Body of believers.
Body of believers, okay. I know for a lot of people it's it's all about the programs, or what can this church offer me. Maybe a lot of people were raised in church. Most people here probably grew up in church. How many of you got into church later in your life once you were adults? All right. Nobody? Okay. Well, it's good. Most of us were brought up in church. Some people may think of a bad experience they had with the previous church. Something didn't go right. They didn't get along with the pastor. Or someone was talking about them, so they ended up leaving. And a lot of people have assumptions of what church is. People that maybe didn't grow up in church but are visiting, they have different assumptions of what church is. Some people think all churches want is money. We haven't preached on money in a while. We probably should have, a lot more than we have. But, not all churches are about money, but a lot of people have that assumption where they go to church, it's going to hear, well, I got to give this, I got to give that, I got to give this much of my money every week, and so they're all wrapped up in that. A lot of people think it's a lifestyle. If I go to church once a week, I'm a good person, I'm doing the religious thing, I'm a religious person if I go to church every week. A lot of people think, well, maybe if I go to church, sometimes it's going to be relevant to my life, sometimes it's not, sometimes I'm just, playing with my phone while preacher's talking, and sometimes it's going to speak to me, sometimes it's not, but I can just go. As long as I sit there, say I've gone to church, it's all good. And a lot of people think church is full of hypocrites, and that's true. The church, sadly, is full of a bunch of hypocrites. And the reason a lot of people attend church is a road to God. A lot of people think, well, if I go to church, I'm okay with God. I know for me growing up, I grew up in church my whole life, but my view of church now is a lot different than it was when I was growing up. For me, growing up, it was like fire insurance. It was like, I get on God's good side, I don't go to hell. I don't have to suffer later. As long as I go to church every week, as long as I, go to Sunday school, sing the hymns, do whatever, then I'm on God's good side. A lot of people go to church because they're guilty for what they did on Saturday night. Hit up the club on Saturday night, come to church on Sunday morning. Whatever the reason is, you're here. Some people go to church because they think that's their duty. And a lot of people go to church because, well, I have to go to church this week, or I have to go to church this. And it's not really important to a lot of people. Well, if I miss this week, I can come next week, or I can do this, I can do that. But that's really not how it's supposed to be. So today, the bottom line of what I want to get across to y'all, you can go ahead and turn the TV on. The bottom line I want to get across to you today is two words. I want you to rethink church. I want you to rethink church today. No matter what misconceptions you have, what church is supposed to be, what church is in your mind, what you grew up thinking church was, rethink it today. Don't do church, be the church. A lot of people go to church, they do church. I got to do church this week, or I'm religious. Be the church. That's what we're talking about today. So I want you to rethink church. And I really, as I got to reading, you read the book of Acts, and you see how life-changing it was back then, and how the early church really had things together. I wonder what they would think of the way that we do church today. What would they think, that we're doing it the same way they did, or are they completely? Frankly, I think they'd be disappointed in the way that church has kind of lost its original meaning and become something, completely different, something that it was never intended to be. When the church started, it was a movement. It was a movement of people redeemed from God based off of one event in human history. And a lot of times that event gets pushed back by some chocolate bunnies. That's what we're celebrating today. Easter. We push it back and we lose. The Easter bunny's coming. Oh yeah, Easter bunny's fine. He's a pretty cool guy. I met him, but he's not what it's all about. It was based on one event, the death and resurrection of Jesus. not on his teachings. Jesus taught for 3.5 years. A lot of people were converted, but his teaching is not what the church was based off of. It's not the movement that the church began as. It began based off of his death and his resurrection. Without that, everything would be for nothing. Everything that we do here now. We celebrate it once a year. That's kind of sad. We should be celebrating it multiple times a year, but sadly, we only celebrate it once a year. When the church started, there were no bulletins or banners or buildings. There was no bands. There was nothing that started with a B. There weren't even Bibles. When the first church started, the early church started, they only had pieces of the Scripture. It wasn't even complete yet, and yet we lose thought of what it really began as today. It began as a movement that was bigger than anything anyone had ever seen before. It began as a movement that could change lives and reshape culture. So before we get to rethinking church and what we want to do, how do we rethink church? How do we be the church? Let's give a little bit of church history for you. So if you can go to the next slide. Ecclesia, or ecclesia, however you want to pronounce it, is the word that's mentioned over 1,000 times in the New Testament word as church. It does not mean building. It means congregation, gathering of called out people. You're called out. You're the ecclesia, the congregation. It's mentioned over 100 times, not 1,000, in the New Testament. And it's not a building. It's a congregation. It's a gathering. It's a group of people, the ecclesia. An example would be Acts 7:38. So I don't have that on the slide. I'm going to go ahead and turn there. Acts 7:38. It says, and this is he that was in the church, or the ecclesia, in the wilderness, with the angel which spake unto him in Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the light of the oracles they gave to us. So it's just an example. This word for church was mentioned over 100 times, ecclesia, the gathering place. It wasn't a building he was talking about. It was the congregation, the gathering of the believers. But today, how do we get the actual word that we have for church? And to get that, you have to go back in history a little bit more, and it originated as a German word. And I'm not German, so I probably won't pronounce it right. If any of you are German, help me out here. Kirch. It has a couple different variations of the way you can spell it, but Kirch, that's how we get our word church. Kirch literally means any centralized location or building. So quickly you can see the transition from the way church began as a movement and as a gathering of people to this centralized building. And it started off as just people, and then it became anyone that had a building had a church, and anyone that had a church, really controlled the people. That's how we get into the if you look in history, you can see that the church controlled a lot of the people back then. People were persecuted. If you didn't go along with the Church of England or this church and that church, you were in trouble. The Pope had ultimate supreme power. And so anyone that owned a building owned a church. And it quickly went from the gathering place from a gathering to a certain location. And anyone, you can say you have a church here and I have a church here, and that's how they started controlling people. And wars were started over this misinterpretation for the word church. You think about the Crusades, everything that happened. They were doing it in the name of the church, right? They were doing it in the name of a building, in the name of the church. Not the name of the ecclesia, the original meaning for church. So wars began over this misinterpretation of this word. So you can see the transition from movement to location. William Tyndale was a translator of the Bible. He translated the Bible into English, and you can see that. Hopefully everyone can. They weren't allowed to smile back then, so I couldn't find a really good picture of him. But this is William Tyndale. He translated the Bible into English, and he said that the Bible alone should determine the practices and doctrines of the church. That every believer should be able to read the Bible in his own language. See, because if you didn't read the original Greek or the Latin or the Hebrew Bible in those days, you couldn't read the Bible. You weren't able to. It was only written in the upper class, the upper echelon language. So you went to church and he read it for you. You couldn't own it yourself. You couldn't really get into it. So he thought that it alone should determine the practices of the church, and every believer, all of us redeemed, all of our church, should be able to have it in their own language. Well, he was considered a heretic in the 16th century, where he fled to Germany. He translated in Germany the New Testament Greek and the Old Testament Hebrew into English, so that the common man could read the Bible, so that all of us, so that this movement wasn't just for one group of people, wasn't just for the upper echelon, wasn't just for the sophisticated, it wasn't just for the government, but it was for everybody, even the common man, me and you, everybody. 1535, he was betrayed by a friend. In 1536, he was tried as a heretic, strangled, and then burned at the stake. So you can see, he gave up his life for what he believed in, and believing that all of us should have a piece of the Bible where we could read, and that alone should determine the way we look at the church today. But when he translated the Bible, when he translated that word church, ecclesia, into English, he didn't translate it to mean building or location. He translated it to mean gathering, congregation, a called out group of people. He didn't translate it to mean just a building. He wanted to know that he wanted everyone to know that church was for everybody, not just certain people. And it was bigger than anything anyone could stop. Where would he get that idea? Well, to know that, we have to go to Matthew. So before you change the slide, I'll tell you a little background story on this. In Matthew 16, 15 through 18, and I have the verses up here, so if you can turn there, you can just wait. But give you a little background on it. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's asking Peter. He says, "Well, what do these people think about me? Who do they say that I am?" And people were calling out names. Some people say, "What does the culture say about me?" Some people say, "You're John the Baptist." Some people say, "You're Elijah or Jeremiah or Moses," and they were going back to the Old Testament, and they were trying to figure out who this guy was. Well, some people say you're this guy and this guy. And then he asked Peter, and that's where we're going to pick up in Matthew. If you go ahead and flip it, it says, "And he said unto them, But whom say ye that I am?" Talking to Simon Peter. And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said unto him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto you, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." But when he asked Peter, it had huge implications for Peter, because Peter was growing up. The boys growing up in that time, the children had to memorize the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They'd have to memorize the entire thing. And in the book